that are entitled to maintain custody, then it wouldn't be that much of a problem because information would never be disclosed, right? If, however, information gets out, right? If information leaks about the torture that detainees had to go through, if the detainees themselves are released and they are afforded the ability to firsthand give accounts of what they experienced at the hands of the custodian, whoever had them in custody, then you can see how torture is going to fuel more nationalist threats, right? If the government that I am attacking, or the government that I'm alleging is participating in human rights violation, is in fact participating in acts of torture, thereby participating in acts of human rights violations, then any information about those violations, any individuals who were themselves tortured that are reintegrated into the larger society, they're going to create a greater threat to the nation itself, right? So that, this is the important point now, right? And this is where you might not have thought we were going to get here, but I wanted to go slowly so that we could get here. Torture is in effect, right, justified by an appeal to national security, but torture, where's my red marker? Oh, don't bring my red marker. I don't have my red one today. Nope, don't have my red one today. But torture undermines national security. Right, what we see, and this is not necessarily a direct finding from the Landau Commission report, I just used that report as a springboard to a much, what I think, more complex and more significant finding, is that torture is justified by an appeal to national security. We are going to use enhanced interrogation tactics or coercive interrogation tactics on a detainee from wherever the detainee might be, because the detainee presents a threat to national security, and there is arguably information that this detainee has that could be used to further safeguard and buttress the national security of Nation X. However, problem occurs when information of those tactics, those coercive tactics, those enhanced tactics, just call it what it is, torture, leaks back into the general population, into the public. Not only domestically is it going to, if we're talking about domestic international issues, not only domestically is it going to create a problem, but obviously the rival nation, right, the alleged terrorist nation, is going to be incentivized now and even legitimized that no, we need to increase our attacks against this foreign power. Why? Because it's been validated, right? So the act of torture undermines, right? Rather than appealing to protecting the nation's interests, the acts of torture actually undermine the nation's interests. I'll give you a contemporary example that should prove the point simply. The detainees from Abu Ghraib, the images go out, they are leaked, everybody in the world sees the horrific atrocities that happened. And if you are a human being, you recognize that they are what they are. It was grievous human rights violations, and it was very, very problematic, right, for the detainees at Abu Ghraib. What we recognize from that is the images themselves validated, right? The images of enhanced interrogation, torture. You couldn't call that enhanced interrogation, right? That was obviously torture. The images of torture that spilled out into the public sphere. First, it was just shock and awe. Anyone was talking about it. But those images were used to fuel even larger threats against the nation, right? Even larger threats, even more radical extremism, because the images demonstrated to, quote-unquote, the opponent, listen, they're playing hardball, if they're going to escalate, and this is how they're going to treat us when we're caught, we're going to fight even harder, right? So that the threat becomes more realized. The threat becomes more significant. Insofar as the threat becomes more significant, you actually undermine, right? You undermine your interests. You undermine your interests of national security, right? And the interest of the government, aside from doing, civil service role that it facilitates, is to protect its population. If images and discourse and information on torture are leaked to the public, and it becomes public knowledge that this is occurring, then you have to recognize that insofar as it becomes public knowledge, that the national threat is going to escalate inherently, right? Because now there's going to be a legitimized attempt to justify an attack on the nation's soil. So what we ended up finding is that, no, this is going to increase hostility, right? Now, again, not a direct finding from the Landau Commission report, using the Landau Commission report to springboard into a larger sort of theoretical discussion on the relationship between sort of the justified, which is what it was, right? The justified use of coercive, quote-unquote, interrogation tactics, and that justification as inherently undermining the protection, the national security of the state itself, right? A little complicated at the end, but hopefully all of that made sense, right? So first bullet point, national security requires the use, arguably, of enhanced interrogation, coercive interrogation techniques, which we saw was undermined. So that was the first bullet point. Second bullet point, enhanced interrogation is markedly different from torture, right? So the question is, how is it legitimized? How is this justification? We know that we're eventually going to undermine the attempt to justify enhanced interrogation or coercive interrogation, it's all the same, coercive interrogation as a legitimate use of power. The next bullet point, enhanced interrogation is markedly different from torture, right? As we've seen, this is an interpretive denial, right? So the claim is that coercive interrogation is different. It's not, right? And we know that this is false. We know that this is false, but it's an attempt to justify, to legitimize the use of coercive interrogation. And the way that this was done, and this is an interesting note in the Landau Commission report, the way that this was done is to say that, no, there already are on the books what's known as the 5 techniques. So what I want to do now is to talk about the 5 techniques briefly, and I have links to discourse on sort of the 5 techniques that were used by British governments against Irish detainees. And I'm not going to get into the technicalities of it, but here are the different forms of techniques, right, of torture. So the 5 techniques. 1, wall standing. 2, hooding. 3, subjection of noise. 4, deprivation of sleep. 5, deprivation of food and water. Alright, so the 5 techniques of torture: wall standing, hooding, subjugation of noise, deprivation of sleep, deprivation of food and drink, right? So the point is, the argument says that the 5 techniques of torture, these techniques described above, do not constitute torture, right, under the GSS interpretation, but rather inhumane and